A lot of people on the left side of politics frequently claim that wokeism cannot be defined when they are criticized as having wokeist beliefs, which forces people to go down a rabbit hole of trying to articulate what wokeism is. The average person can usually identify wokeist beliefs, but struggles to provide a concise and straightforward description. This is understandable, because wokeism is a bunch of different beliefs combined together from different philosophical schools of thought. Many the average person isn't very familiar with, even if they can recognize what the ideas from these schools are. I produced this video essay to help people articulate what wokeism is, and why it is fundamentally incorrect about the claims made by its believers. Let me read you the definition for wokeism that I created for my book, Martel's Concise Encyclopedia of Modern Philosophy Concepts. This is an encyclopedia I created that summarizes complex philosophical ideas, so it is easy to understand for those new to philosophy. This is the description I created, based on my research. Wokeism, a term that has emerged in contemporary discourse, often used to describe a cultural and political awareness of societal issues that is rooted in postmodernist New Left philosophy concerning social and racial justice. It is not a formalized philosophical doctrine, but rather a colloquial expression that has gained traction in public and academic debates, especially in the context of identity politics, social activism, and cultural criticism. The development of wokeism can be seen as part of a broader historical context of civil rights and social justice movements. The term woke has its roots in the Black radical tradition of African American-centric political ideology, and originally meant being awake to racial prejudice and discrimination. It gained mainstream recognition through its usage in the Black Lives Matter movement and other social justice campaigns, which claimed to emphasize awareness of social inequalities, systemic racism, and the need for inclusive and equitable practices. Wokeism is characterized by an activist stance against racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression as defined by New Left political ideologies such as critical race theory, third wave feminism, and intersectionality that have become prominent in the contemporary Black radical tradition since the 1990s. As such, the term wokeism today is used as an umbrella term to label a belief in a wide range of various New Left ideas, rooted in Marxist thought including third wave feminism, epistemic decolonization, Jacques Derrida's deconstruction theory, and the critical theory associated with the Frankfurt School. From a purely philosophical position, wokeism is generally equivalent to intersectionality, which claims to examine the ways race, class, gender, and other identity categories intersect in systems of oppression by using an analytical method that incorporates all of the previously mentioned New Left concepts into a unified school of thought. Intersectionalists claim to examine the power dynamics in society, the construction of social identities, and the impact of cultural narratives on perceptions of race, gender, and class. Despite its claimed intentions of promoting social justice and equality, wokeism has faced significant criticism, which are criticisms generally shared with criticisms of intersectionality. Critics argue that it leads to a form of cultural policing, where individuals or groups are quickly censured for perceived transgressions against the prevailing norms of political correctness. This, they argue, stifles free speech and leads to a culture of censorship. Another criticism of wokeism is that it prioritizes identity politics over broader socio-economic issues, potentially fragmenting social movements into competing identity groups. Critics claim this approach detracts from addressing systemic issues like economic inequality and class struggles. Wokeism has also been critiqued for its emphasis on performative activism, also known as virtue signaling, where support for social justice causes is expressed more through social media and symbolic gestures than through sustained, substantive actions. This critique points to the need for deeper engagement with social issues beyond superficial displays of solidarity. Intersectionality, while illuminating complex social dynamics, often faces critiques for its perceived contradictions. Detractors argue it struggles to reconcile various identities, leading to tension within its framework. This philosophical school of thought, aimed at understanding how overlapping social categories impact experiences of oppression, can sometimes obscure rather than clarify. Such contradictions raise essential questions about its effectiveness as a tool for social justice and academic discourse. Intersectionality itself as a philosophical school of thought is also criticized for its contradictory nature. Chiefly, It is criticized for its heavy reliance on data produced by empiricism schools of inquiry such as from sociology fields, including psychology and political science, while simultaneously relying prominently on a framework rooted in critical theory which is inherently opposed to empirical methods of inquiry into social issues. This tendency to rely on data that critical theory inherently claims to be mistaken results in intersectionalist claims, frequently violating a fundamental rule of logic, the principle of non-contradiction. Critics argue the violation of the principle of non-contradiction by intersectionalists results in intersectionalists able to prove any claim to be true, even if it is clearly not. This results in another violation of logic, the principle of explosion. In summary, while wokeism represents a contemporary cultural trend towards greater awareness and activism around issues of social justice, it also embodies the complexities and challenges of navigating identity politics, social activism, and cultural change in the modern world. The term encapsulates a range of practices and attitudes that are central to ongoing debates about race, equality, and social justice in contemporary society. To fully understand wokeism, see my entries for Black Radical Tradition, Postmodernism, New Left, Critical Theory, Critical Race Theory, Third Wave Feminism, Intersectionality, Decolonization, Epistemic Deconstruction, Deconstruction and Reconstruction, Anti-Racism and Racial Capitalism. Now I recognize that this definition references several other ideas explored in other entries in the encyclopedia, but I think the most important of these for understanding why wokeism is not a legitimate academic discipline, but instead a collection of beliefs more akin to a religion, is by first understanding the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of explosion. So let's look at what these concepts mean. The principle of non-contradiction is also known as the law of non-contradiction. It is the principle that contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. This is a fundamental principle, or axiom, of classic logic and has played a pivotal role in the development of Western philosophy. The earliest formulation of the principle of non-contradiction is attributed to Aristotle, who, in his work, Metaphysics, explicitly stated that it is impossible for the same attribute at once to belong and not to belong to the same subject, and in the same respect. Aristotle's articulation of the principle of non-contradiction laid the groundwork for classical logic, and has been central to philosophical thought ever since. In the modern era, philosophers such as Immanuel Kant emphasized the role of the principle of non-contradiction in underpinning the laws of thought and reality. The principle of non-contradiction is a fundamental principle in most logical and philosophical systems. It is often considered a necessary presupposition for coherent discourse and rational argumentation. The principle underpins much of the reasoning in fields ranging from mathematics to ethics and is a key component of the study of logic. So how does this apply to wokeism? As I pointed out earlier, wokeism is a colloquial expression for ideas promoted by a number of specific philosophical frameworks, in particular intersectionality, which itself is a hybrid framework built from critical theory. Intersectionality takes data from studies produced by non-critical theory frameworks, specifically from sociology fields like political science, psychology and economic sociology, and then filters the data from studies in these fields through a lens that uses critical theory. The problem with this is that all of these sociology fields come from the branch of philosophy that is empiricism, and critical theory is not part of that same branch of philosophy. It's actually from a branch called rationalism, which is basically the total opposite of empiricism. To simplify this for you, empiricism is the belief that knowledge is derived from sensory experiences and observations, whereas rationalism is the belief knowledge is self-evident and can be obtained purely through reasoning alone. What we call modern science today is actually a branch of empiricism, and sociology is also a branch of empiricism as well. By contrast, critical theory is a rationalist framework that is expressly anti-positivist, which is a term that describes the belief that human society, our social world, cannot be studied using the same methods as natural sciences. Sociology is not an anti-positivist framework, as it uses empirical methods to research and study human society. Critical theory, however, is anti-positivist and says empirical methods cannot produce accurate conclusions about human society. Do you see the issue here yet? Do you see how the principle of non-contradiction is violated by wokeism? When supporters of wokeism, or intersectionality in general, use data produced by empirical methods of inquiry, and cite it as evidence for their beliefs. They are violating the principle of non-contradiction in philosophy, which is critical for rationalism. Because critical theory is a rationalist framework that says anything produced by empiricism is flawed, and all these other studies intersectionalists cite in their writings are empirical ones, that means they are creating an unavoidable contradiction that is fatal to all of their conclusions. You cannot mix and match opposing schools of philosophical thought, as you're tainting it with data from different methods. That creates a contradiction. For a comparison, it would be like mixing Christianity with Buddhism, and claiming it to still be Christianity. If you mix other very different belief systems together that hold contradictory conclusions about the world, how can you possibly produce a coherent rational conclusion? And you obviously cannot. Yet that is what intersectionalists constantly do in their writings. They use data produced by empirical studies to justify their rationalist conclusions. That violates a fundamental rule of logic, the law of non-contradiction, because it creates a contradiction in the claimed beliefs. You cannot claim that empirical research methods are wrong yet then turn around and cite the results of those methods just because their conclusions might prove useful for you to win an ideological debate. Critical theory is a very different analytical framework compared to those used in empirical fields like political science and psychology, and they cannot be mixed together. Now let's delve into the principle of explosion. This logical rule states that when a contradiction exists within a belief, any conclusions drawn from it will inevitably be nonsensical. This happens because the contradiction renders the definitions of true and false meaningless. As a result, you could claim anything to be true, even if it isn't. Building new beliefs upon a contradictory foundation means abandoning the principles of logic, as the terms true and false lose all coherence, and logical thinking ceases altogether. To better understand this concept, let's go back to my example with religions, mixing Christianity with Buddhism. In Christianity, it is believed there is one true God, and that when people die their souls can go to heaven. But in Buddhism, there are many gods who each have their own heaven-like places called Pure Lands. Buddhism is a polytheistic religion, which accepts the existence of numerous gods, whereas Christianity is monotheistic and believes in only one God. These religions cannot both be true, as their fundamental claims about the world contradict one another. So any further claims about the nature of gods by someone who says there is one God but also many gods, obviously their claims are inherently flawed because that statement makes no logical sense. Now let's go back to what is happening with intersectionality, which relies on critical theory, a rationalist branch of philosophy whose foundational premise is the claim you cannot use empirical methods to investigate human society. Yet despite this being a fundamental belief in critical theory, intersectionalists still combine critical theory with data produced by empirical fields such as psychology and political science. That's a contradiction, and that is why intersectionality is not a legitimate academic field, but instead a pseudo-academic one that violates its own claimed beliefs. This is why I and others often suggest intersectionality is more similar to a religion than an academic field because its beliefs do not depend on rigorous logical structure, but instead a passionate belief by its supporters of the claims made by intersectionalists being correct for reasons that are usually more personal and emotional rather than well-reasoned and researched. I hope this video essay has enlightened you on the importance for people in modern society to have a strong understanding of philosophy. I think it is a grave mistake that we do not teach proper philosophy in the public education system as a required course, and that this gap is being exploited by people to spread intersectionality ideology in our society, pretending that it is legitimate academic research when it is very obviously not. Real academic work falls strictly into a recognizable branch of philosophy, which intersectionality doesn't actually do because it doesn't stay strictly in the realm of rationalism as it claims to do. Instead, intersectionalist believers just combine whatever data they deem convenient to support the claims made by the believer, and they discard any data that is inconvenient to those beliefs. This makes intersectionality more like a religion, which is why I frequently refer to it as a pseudo-religion. It may not have a god, but it sure does have fantastical, metaphysical beliefs that defy both logic and legitimate scientific inquiry, and relies on faith instead of logic, which is why I conclude it cannot properly be labeled as a genuine academic field. So now in the future, you should share this video to others whenever you have difficulty explaining to people why critical race theory, intersectionality, third wave feminism, and other kinds of wokeism ideologies are not correct. If you enjoyed this essay and want to learn more about philosophy, I have other videos on this channel. You can also buy my book, Martel's Concise Encyclopedia of Modern Philosophy Concepts. This is an encyclopedia I created that summarizes complex philosophical ideas, so it is easy to understand for those new to philosophy. It is a very affordable book available for purchase on Amazon.